Hi, everybody. Welcome to our very first lecture for the School of Design lecture series at Carnegie Mellon. We are absolutely thrilled today to be welcoming Dimeji Onafuwa, Dr. Dimeji Onafuwa. And I'll say more about him in a minute, but first I just wanted to let you know that the School of Design lecture series is faculty and student-led. We have representatives from the undergraduate, the master's, and the PhD program on our committee. And together we've put together a selection of lectures this semester that I think are going to be really great. So we kick off with Dr. Dimeji Onafuwa today. And then on March 8th, we're going to have DeRoy Peraza of HyperAct. And then on March 15th, we're going to have Vikas Javide and Andy Chen of Isometric. And then we'll be followed by a few more lectures throughout the semester. You can find more on the School of Design website. I am really excited that Dimeji's coming. He is the first graduate of a PhD in transition design since we changed over and rebooted our PhD program. I'm doubly honored because I had the pleasure of being his doctoral advisor. Dimeji is a wonderful person, and I'm going to turn over the mic, so to speak, to Megan Urban to introduce Dimeji.
Thanks, Molly. So a little brief introduction to Dimeji's bio. Dr. Dimeji Onafuwa is a designer and researcher with several years of combined experience in UX design and research, transition design, service design, and social design. He has worked in a number of different capacities, from a design leader to UX consultant and researcher. After working as a senior designer researcher at Microsoft, where he explored the future of work, Dimeji recently joined Google as a senior researcher in the cloud commerce space. He also teaches design at Emily Carr University in Vancouver. Dimeji earned a PhD in design from Carnegie Mellon University. While at CMU, his research explored the commons and commons-based approaches to user experience. Before his PhD, Dimeji earned an MBA in management from UNC Charlotte and BAs in design and studio art from Concord University. Dimeji co-founded the Common Cause Collective, an interdisciplinary group of designers who use transition design methodologies for social impact in the Pacific Northwest. He has published a book chapter on design for the greater good, given talks, conducted workshops on design's role in social justice. And I guess I'll turn it over to Dimeji. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Thanks, Megan, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you, Molly, for not only being here, but just I think the doctor, added to my name. I think you're partially responsible or culpable for that. So thank you for that. And thank you for my family, my Carnegie Mellon School of Design family. Thank you for inviting me to share my ideas with you today. So obviously, my name is Dimeji Onafuwa. I'm a designer, I'm an artist. I like to think of myself also as an artist and a design researcher. But before we begin, I just want to share that anything I mention, the ideas that I talk about today, obviously do not represent the organizations that I've worked for, or I'm working for. And now that that's out of the way, I want to take us on a journey to a world where many worlds fit. A journey that would cause us to go back and redefine the boundaries around our discipline, and that would inspire us to look forward to a different way of living together. I'm going to share my screen. I think it's, and see if you can see that. All right, so this journey is going to tell the story of our collective past and our collective present and the future we want to make. So I want to start us here. To the left is Sankofa, the ancient Adinkra symbol, a perfect symbol for the season because it's sometimes represented in a heart shape, much like this. And it's also an important starting point for us to, for our conversation today because of what it means. It can be loosely translated to mean it is not taboo to fetch what is at risk of being left behind. So in other words, we are looking to the past to determine our future. So much like Sankofa, the Nsibidi symbols are ancient pre-colonial ideographs. And if you were in my doctoral dissertation, which feels like years ago, eons ago, I shared a lot of these symbols in my work. So Nsibidi symbols permeated the movie The Black Panther, featuring the late Chadwick Boseman, God rest his soul. So when I was in your ranks, I explored these ideographs and others. And what I particularly love about the Nsibidi is its literal meaning to transition. So I want to challenge us to use this time that we have together to explore what that word really means. We must, to ensure that we are designing for transitions, we must challenge our assumptions on diversity or even on inclusion. And through the products and the services and the processes that we are designing, we are presuming a certain future. And we are suggesting a way to live. So challenging this perspective on design means that we must work together to ensure that our collective livelihoods is sustainable. And that is one that protects the rights of others to exist in the future we're making together. Such a posture must force us to think differently about what we're making. So I want to spend time with you today on that journey of how what made us can in the future remake us. And my journey starts here. So this is my dad living in Nigeria in the mid-60s after he's lost his mom and his father at a young age. Everything he owned was in his bag. So he went on to the United Kingdom, found a job in the Nigerian consulate, and then ended up in Western Michigan, of all places in Kalamazoo, on a soccer scholarship. And a lot has happened since then. So we recently went home, siblings, spouses, and children, to mark Dad's 75th birthday on what was, quote, a small family gathering. Well, needless to say, this was anything but. And as we like to fondly refer to him, Daddy-O was very happy and very proud. So this visit, this exciting visit to Nigeria, culminated from Lagos, which is the capital or commercial capital of Nigeria, to Shagamu, just 30 miles outside of Lagos. A trip that normally took us, or would normally take us about 30 minutes, took over 2 hours, believe it or not, due to bad roads. And this distance was about the same, just to give you a little context, of the distance from where I live to the Seattle-Tacoma airport, which is about 35 minutes on a good day. But most of our commute on the expressway was like this. And these were two major Nigerian cities. So as my buddy responded during the travel to the undulations of the road, I was reminded by a scene in Mad Max Fury Road. And that the future always exists in many different forms of complexity. Like William Gibson, the future's author and pioneer of cyberpunk, aptly put it, the future is already here. It's not just evenly distributed. So when we change the context from where we find ourselves today in the West to what we call the majority worlds, we see leapfrogging technologies embedded in everyday life. They remind us that our experiences are socio-cultural and socio-technical, and that good designs must work at these intersections. I often borrow from the work of Laurent Thévenot, a sociologist, defining social science as the science of life together in this world, to postulate that designers should seek to understand how design enables our living together. It means that we must go beyond traditional design practices to find new ways to see how we might sculpt interactions differently, to start to understand the rights of others to coexist. So today, I want to investigate this charge a little further. Designers, as Alan Chochinov puts it, are in the consequences business. We have an obligation to look at the work we do differently. And to deliver this charge, I want to begin by investigating what we mean by designing with difference in mind, by introducing you, or some of you, and reintroducing others to the notion of the pluriverse. And using examples, I will posit that design is rooted in a patriarchal ontology, and that the way we define difference is often exclusionary. And then I'll follow by what I mean by an ontological shift from the ideas of the universal, designing for all, to the pluriversal, designing with all. And then finally, I have started to lay out these principles I've been investigating all over the place. I've been exploring these principles in the space, and I want to investigate them with you. I want you to help me critique them. And I want to end with an admonishment for the discipline. Like, talk about what a designer must do, or the designer of the future must do, to challenge this narrative of inclusion. So it starts with small steps, and so will I. So now let's begin. So one great privilege I had of having studied at a school such as Carnegie Mellon is the opportunity to share ideas with great minds. One of such privileges came about to me during a transition design seminar when I sat with Arturo Escobar over lunch. Arturo Escobar is a Colombian-American anthropologist and decolonial theorist. And prior to meeting Arturo over lunch, I had mentioned to him that I was conducting some research that looked into the redefinition of the commons, expanding the commons to include resources that are important to our collective survival. So I shared that transition design is a lens we can use to understand how we might begin to shift this paradigm of resource usage from just usage alone to collective ownership and sharing. So during that meeting, Escobar stressed the importance of collectivism to solving resource crises we find in this age. And it was during that lunch that I got introduced to the idea of the pluriverse. A couple of years later, I encountered Escobar's new book that lays out his argument for pluriverse and why it's important for designers to think differently about the work they do. In his book, Escobar draws the definition of the pluriverse, a world where many worlds fit. From the Zapatistas who were engaged in the liberation struggle in Mexico in the 1980s and 90s. So what does this mean? Well, we see from this quote by Escobar that designs for the pluriverse is about the difference that all marginalized or subaltern groups have lived with day in, day out, and the privileged ones can afford to overlook. It means that for us to design for full inclusivity or inclusion, one must forego dualist ontologies that characterize the prevailing version of Western modernity. For example, mind and body, subject and object, self and other. And one must emerge with a new way of being in this world, one that requires making with and not just for. So I always love to share Sylvia's work, Sylvia Matamarin, who also graduated from Carnegie Mellon. This is some earlier work she did when she was representing pluriversality through the illustrations of acculturation strategies. Sylvia uses immigration as an example in her research. So using this model to represent the way we think about our worlds is a great way to see how we include and exclude, especially the different boundaries that we form and the different modes of othering that we employ. Sylvia thinks of these strategies in terms of varying degrees of desirability. So this slide by Sylvia Matamarin, or Dr. Sylvia Matamarin, represents a traditional modes of acculturation. We assume that integration into a dominant paradigm, as was often referred to as inclusion, is the most desirable mode. But pluriversality presents a different option, one that represents and acknowledges different ways of being. So every heritage or dominant or hybrid practice must co-assimilate to represent all the different perspectives. This final version shows the interplay between dominant practices, otherwise those practices that essentially perpetuate the colonial dominance, heritage practices and hybrid practices, and how they intertwine to form pluriversality. So what does this mean to design? It means that we must design with difference in mind. So according to Escobar, those different perspectives are normalized and nourished across different spheres. For example, in the biological realm, with resource sharing or the commons, like I shared with you earlier. Or as it relates to epistemic difference with coloniality versus decoloniality. Or of course, as it relates to cultural difference, or ontological difference with the pluriverse. So as it relates to common resources, I often share the work of Garrett Hardin, or his argument in the 1968 essay he wrote titled Tragedy of the Commons. He argues that selfish human behavior depletes the common resources to the point of destroying the commons. So in other words, Hardin believed that the different interests of exploiters of common resources cause them to protect their rights in their own interest. And he also believed that privatization and governmental oversight are the vital countermeasures needed to maintain common pool resource use and avert this tragedy. Well, side note on Hardin, he often perpetuated an anti-immigration nativist agenda. You see, he leveraged his relative prominence as a respected academic at UC Santa Barbara to rail against immigration, which he believed to be responsible for the overpopulation of the United States by immigrants. We saw that, Hardin saw that this as an existential threat and peddled this pseudoscience that leveraged exclusionary agendas and emphasized bordering and enclosure tactics as a means of population control and environmental sustenance. Well, this argument has been prevailing. We're hearing much of this Hardin's tactics today. These theories that result in othering and exclusion. Ostrom, as I love to share her work, and several others point to a different perspective on the commons, one that privileges human cooperation. Ostrom claims that solution to overconsumption as a problem in the commons is not driven by access limitation, but instead through internal governance and stewardship mechanisms. She lays out design principles as essential ingredients for the success of using common pool resources. These principles help to sustain the commons. In other words, everyone plays their part to keep the system stable, including human and non-human participants. So in my doctoral study, I argue that these rules and systems and practices around sharing resources bleed toward beyond how they are owned to how they are shared. Two examples I explored were tenancy and data, particularly open government data. I looked at how we might be able to help designers bring these into the commons by working with collectives. So the commons are systems. And even in design, diversity within systems lead to resiliency. For example, I work in product design, and we always are confronted with the question of inclusion in our daily work. What defines the boundaries we create in our work? How transparent or opaque must these boundaries be? As we ensure that we look at the entire system as we solve problems for users, we should also be aware of the global boom of design and how that might have been, that is now synonymous with postmodernism and globalization, especially in its commercial application. As even Illich skeptically states, a world mired in ever-increasing production is the fallacy of the growth imperative we're confronted with in our present society. So in a piece for Design and Culture that I wrote, I addressed epistemic decoloniality through the lens of race by channeling the late Martinican post-colonial theorist Arturo Escobar in his challenge of Western epistemologies on race and identity in the French Antilles, by stating that exercising the right to be opaque is a form of resistance to colonial legacy, since it pushes back against what it calls creolization, which can be perceivable as a form of cultural absorption that inevitably leads to cultural erasure. Glisson's work draws the origins of creolization from the New World colonial legacies of domination. So in design, we see effects much like creolization in the normalization strategies that we perpetuate through symbolic oppression. Erasure tactics are revealed in the totalitarianism seen in West-centric design, where designers make clear judgments about what we decide is valid, as well as what we decide to exclude as other. So the response for us then is to design features that are less influenced by universalist consumerist culture that we find ourselves in, but instead to begin to propose a more pluriversal mode of being, one that protects the rights of others to be opaque. So how do we do that? Well, some of you are very familiar with Anne-Marie Willis's work on ontological designing, or in other words, how we've come to be who we are, or who or what we are in this modern world. Something like we design our world, and while our world acts back on us and designs us. So design designs. Well, according to what Tony Fry shares in this quote, the features we are making in the global north have consequences on what some of us call the majority worlds, or what others call the global south. So we are making these worlds unbearable for others. Also, according to Fry, since design is rooted in modernity, it's particularly positioned to be part of the toolkit that we need to transition to the pluriverse. What this means is that what is assumed to be the center of design culture will need to be decoupled from colonial influences of modernity and relinked to pluriversal narratives representing multiple centers. Annibal Chiano refers to this as epistemic decolonization. So as a delinking and relinking that results in the foregrounding of other epistemologies, outside of the Western ones, in order to reduce the dominance of Europeanism in design. So this slide, just another side note, is about the Kenyan speculative artist who works on integrate eyewear. I love his work. His name is Cyrus Kabiru. His work pushes the boundaries of conventional craftsmanship, design, and fashion, that's mostly controlled by the West. So he's best known for this collection of eyewear, sea stunners, he calls them, and he self-portrait photographs that capture him wearing these creations. So I feel that Kabiru's work deals with imaginations of the future and the transformations of modernization. So, as we find ourselves in this dualist ontology of the modernist traditions that define design, what then do we do to ensure that this is not homogeneous, that design is not homogeneous, narrowed, or exclusive? Well, I've been working on these principles, as I shared with you earlier, that will help us to start thinking about what we do in this space. The first principle is straightforward. We must respect the perspectives of the non-expert stakeholder. Ezio Manzini distinguishes the difference between diffuse design and expert design by calling diffuse design the skill of designing and expert design the professional practice of design. And I'm thinking I'm paraphrasing here. For expert design or expert designers to avoid what he calls big ego design, they must use artifacts differently as tools that propose possibilities for collaboration instead of positioning the designer in the center of the project as omniscient. Well, that means we must engage with participants differently, early and often. Working with Portland Tenants United allowed me to, during my doctoral study, allowed me to introduce new perspectives on the relationships between landlords and tenants by creating a set of cards that serve as artifacts that keep proposing in order to engage participants and present new perspectives on an old problem. So together, we saw through the work that we did that contentious housing relationships as a phenomenon might not be consistent across cultural boundaries. For example, I noticed from growing up in Yoruba in sub-Saharan Africa that collaborative approaches to solving housing problems existed. I also know that Yoruba word for landlord is onile. It's kinda in its meaning and can be loosely translated to the homeowner or even the head of the household. And the word for tenant, agbatoju, which means steward, is also a kind of translation. So we were able to conclude together through the work we did that when we expand cultural understandings, we might be presented with opportunities to shift our paradigms to how we deal with the dilemmas we find in the Western Hemisphere. So number 2, fight symbolic violence. This principle admonishes us to work against what I call emotional carelessness in terms of our ideas, our practices, our products, and our tools. So what is symbolic violence? Well, I must say that I was quite fortunate to have worked with Dr. Joanna Bonert and help lead a conversation about design and symbolic violence at DRS in Brighton, Design Research Society conference in Brighton several years ago. I was also co-delivered a paper with her on design and symbolic violence at Design and Decoloniality Conference in Malmo. Well, symbolic violence was introduced by Pierre Bourdieu in 1979. His research attempted to understand how class, power, and social inequities are reproduced at cultural and social levels. So here's how Bourdieu defines symbolic violence: as a gentle violence, imperceptible and invisible even to its victims, and is exerted for the most part through the purely symbolic channels of communication and cognition, or even precisely miscognition, recognition, or even feeling. I often share this example of the Kodak Shirley cards of the 50s and the legacy of racism that is perpetuated even till today through design, especially when I'm trying to talk about issues about who gets to define what exactly is normal. So it is through the process of symbolic violence that power imbalances are naturalized. The most intolerable conditions of existence can often be perceived as acceptable or even natural. So designers have this unique role to flip that argument and politicize their work, from designers' manipulation that leads to erasure to design as emancipation that will lead to presencing. So number 3, act as an ally. And these terms here are very deliberate because I believe that we can't be allies. We can only act as allies. And prior to his death, the great author Chinua Achebe frequently shares this quote that I have overused along with others. It's an African proverb: until the lions have their own historians, the story of the hunt will glorify the hunter. Our responsibilities as designers blends into recognizing that there's a lion's side of the story. And that can only be done when we situate ourselves in other worlds, when we amplify the storytelling and we allow for the legitimacy of other narratives. So in other words, as I often share, designers are platform builders. The great Toni Morrison often talks about how we have to learn to participate in other people's worlds. She sees her work as unapologetically Black and female, and she makes no excuses for the realities of her world. So if you want to understand my world, you come into my world. So when I think about the importance of seeking local knowledge and applying a little empathy as an ally to one's work, I can't help but be reminded by this yet again often overused example, the roundabout play pump, a water pumping system built to provide water from the energy formed by kids playing or kids in play. Someone obviously thought about that this was a great idea when it was designed. But now we all understand the implications and the catastrophic failures of this type of idea. But how would you feel if your kids had to provide labor just to get water? Something that is clearly a fundamental resource for human existence. So number 4, be multimodal. Design takes many shapes and forms across different times. So we have to be careful, and this is particularly painful in UX design or product making that I find myself in. But we have to be careful for linear approaches to scale and hierarchy. As different roles shift in a more collaborative design or process, designers have to be willing to shift with those changes. So one thing we all know too well in UX design and research is the hierarchy of user needs, an iteration of Maslow's hierarchy of needs for product making. However, there's a lot more complexity to human needs, especially with making products that satisfy their needs. So in my work, I often postulate that human needs are much more intertwined and codependent than Maslow claims and that UXers have adopted. So obviously the point of this image is not for you to go into the details of it because it's very complex. And the expectations is not for us to go through every part, but I wanted to contrast Maslow with Manfred McNeef's way of classifying fundamental human needs differently as one correlated, so axiological needs for creation, identity, freedom, subsistence, and so forth, and interspersed with existential needs for being, having, doing, interacting. So satisfiers often exist at the intersections of these needs. So McNeef claims that the modernist agenda is to present pseudo-satisfiers to needs through consumerism, through advertising, and through propaganda. So number 5, adopting collective agency. So not every experience that is designed requires hierarchy. So you have to push to be otherworldly. You have to embrace diversity. You have to work from all angles of the problem, including that of the human and non-human participant. When I think of collective agency, I am reminded that our collective destinies are intertwined. For example, the degradation of our medical commons and the emergence of new diseases that are decimating our communities, particularly those of underrepresented minorities. We see from the recent COVID-19 pandemic, the reason I'm obviously not here with you in person, that the actions that we take directly impact the lives of others. What can we learn from this new way of being? Well, for one, the way we care for each other, or the way we care for one another, is connected to the quality of our collective lives. Or even with environmental injustice or environmental racism, from Flint to Standing Rock, we see all around us also that we must reconsider the way we show up and participate in our worlds. What products we create, how we share those essential resources, with whom we share them, as well as which resources that we decide are essential. So number 6, stewardship. Our stewarding the right of others. Stewardship always requires responsibility beyond the right to access resources. Designers are gatekeepers for the rights of others. When I think about this, I always think about people that are championing the right of others when it comes to accessibility and other forms of inclusion. I can't help but to think of the work of Sarah Hendren on the politics of disabilities. Sarah actually spoke at Carnegie Mellon when I was there as a doctoral student, and I was enamored by her work. Her work investigates the boundaries of what is normal by receiving adaptability and accessibility across spectrums. So you have to make sure you check out her work. Okay, number 7, lending upstream privilege. Be humble enough to acknowledge the consequences of your work. In her work on the commons, Elinor Ostrom refers to a concept of negative externalities. That is, with regards to the commons, an upstream exploiter of a resource is often oblivious to the effects downstream. Say, for example, a polluter gets the benefit of a pollution, and someone else in the population living where the pollution ends up experiences the costs. So we have to see our roles of designers this way. We have to have a fair amount of privilege. We have a fair amount of privilege that comes with the work we do, and privilege that allows us to separate ourselves from the consequences of our work. So I have in the past shared the role of designers of upstream allies in conferences and workshops and whatnot. Designer allies, I said, are sensitive to downstream impacts, and upstream allies, they reside outside of the boundaries in question, benefit from the oppression of others, but they, however, commit to lending privilege to the point of breaking it. They cede power and act to empower. So developments that I have shared, unfortunately, they keep growing. Portland, Charlottesville, Minneapolis, Kenosha, other cities are examples of implications of extending privilege. The Portland particularly struck me because I lived there when it happened. A couple of upstream allies stood up for 2 Muslim girls against white supremacists and unfortunately lost their lives for it. And that's really what it means to extend your privilege to the point of breaking it. And finally, number 8, last but not the least, designers must stay with the trouble. This is riffing from Donna Haraway's work, Staying with the Problem. And you must do this in your posture, in your approach, in your mindset. Staying with the trouble requires making with humans and non-humans. That is, we require each other in unexpected collaborations, unexpected combinations, and we collectively negotiate together. We become with each other, or not at all. According to Donna Haraway, this kind of material semiotics is always situated, always someplace, but not no place, and always entangled and always worldly. So to wrap things up, pluriversal designers must follow these principles, or they must use these principles as provocations as they attempt to negotiate or re-engage with their worlds. They have to be egalitarian, so respect the perspective of the non-expert. They have to fight symbolic violence. They have to act as allies, always allowing the right stories to be told. They have to be multimodal in their approach, working at different scales from the interaction to the systemic. They cannot be linear with their engagement with others. They have to adopt collective agency. Not everything must have hierarchy. They have to be pushed to be otherworldly. They have to embrace diversity and work on all angles of the problem. They have to steward the rights of others. They have to be aware of upstream privilege, all the consequences of their work. And finally, they have to stay with the problem. Every designer must commit to the problem they are working to solve. You must stay with the problem, and you must continue to be aware of the consequences of the work that you do. And particularly in the face of injustice, they must ask themselves these three questions. These are questions that propositions that I worked with Jay Bloom to use as a way of engaging with designers. What are you designing? How does it support structural injustice? What can you do to mitigate these injustices? And obviously, these principles are not set in stone. As I mentioned at the beginning, they're always evolving. I welcome additions, updates, corrections, and they're meant to serve as a way to get us thinking together. They're intended to be provocative by nature and to approach long-term, and to cause us to approach the long-term consequences of the work that we do. So here's my charge to the future designer. In the conclusions in his book, Designs for the Pluriverse, and in quoting Jane Bennett, Escobar admonishes designers to forego the modernist perspectives of, quote, self-improvement in favor of the ethics of autonomous interexistence, while at the same time ensure that we still understand our capacity to operate in the modern world in which we find ourselves. For example, I work closely with this group that I co-founded called Common Cause Collective in the Seattle area, a group of designers of different persuasions that work together to do just that. We just wrapped up the first phase of a transition design project with the BIPOC communities or community leaders as well as the city of Seattle. We worked together on this project funded by the city to map out the regenerative economy for the region as a transition design problem, one that includes often unheard voices. We ended the sessions that took several weeks with collective visioning and the forming of communities of practice around addressing these issues. So I'll end with this. As we go back to fetch alternative ways of understanding the problems we face, we must remember that we are our ancestors' dreams. The image to the left was taken at the death of my grandfather, the Balogun Dodondawa, the head warrior of Makum Shagamu in Ogun State. On the right is my tribute to the lovely brown faces that inspire me to keep going. They help to carry my dreams forward. So let these photos serve as a further provocation. I ask you, whose futures are your dreams remaking? I am calling us to become more deliberate with the worlds with which we are engaging and act towards a future predicated on difference. So once again, it's been a pleasure to share my thoughts with you and to reconnect with old friends, albeit virtually. And I want us to extend this conversation beyond this meeting we're having today. So I'm on Instagram @ Dimeji, on Twitter @CastleJulie, and on LinkedIn. So thank you so much for the opportunity to present to you.
Dimeji, thank you so much. I hope we can have a big round of virtual applause. You won't be able to see everybody who's out there. Although you might see a couple of comments coming through. There are a couple of questions right now in Q&A, and I encourage all of you to put your own questions in Q&A if you are watching on Zoom. I'm also taking a look on Facebook, and so if you've got anything that you'd like to be asking there, we can do that as well. And Dimeji, if you stop sharing your screen right now, we can go back. Or let's see, there we go. Perfect. All right, wonderful. I hope you can see the wild applause. The first question comes from Stuart Candy, who says, Dimeji, thank you for an absolutely fantastic talk. My question is about the 8 principles. In recommending these to designers, how would you suggest that people start? Is one point of departure as good as any other, or is there some kind of hierarchy or necessary point of entry in your experience?
Yeah, that's, hey, Stuart. Yeah, so hopefully we get to see him face to face sometime soon again. That's a really excellent question. So one of the things I was trying to do, is, as I shared earlier, is design, talking about the ontological design and about designing and using the tools of design and the tools that designers use to solve their problem back on us, and using those tools to cause us to think about the problems that we're causing. So this is really, to a certain extent, I almost see this as a Trojan horse. So these principles are a way of causing us to talk about the work that we do. So because of that, and just to be able to avoid some of the critique that I present in as well, there's no entry point. There's no hierarchy. So you don't have to, think in terms of this is what I need to do first. But I think it's important to ask yourself those questions. What are these, what are the potential challenges of the work that I'm doing, and how do I use them to reorient myself and reapproach my work differently? So the short answer to your question, Stuart, is no, there's no hierarchy. If you had to start anywhere, I'd say start with staying with the problem. Stay with the problem. Stay with the problem you're seeking to resolve, and have a posture of engagement. I think this is like an important part of transition design, is always thinking long term.
I find myself really grappling with the state of the world. I think like lots of us are, and feeling quite small in the face of really, really big issues. And so I find myself wondering, how do we apply these principles in such a polarized landscape?
Yeah.
Do you see?
Yeah.
How do we find our ways in?
Yeah, so that's an important question to ask. So in teaching my students at Emily Carr, we've been wrestling with those as well. Having to face the world we're facing, and kind of like trying to understand, okay, how do I engage? I think it really starts with understand. For one thing, I feel like designers need. They need to do a little more critical thinking. They need to learn more. They need to read a lot more about the world we are making. I think starting there, I think, is an important first step. But going beyond that, I think just understanding that we're not here to solve the world's problems. Just to speak as plainly as possible, our role in the world is not to solve the world's problems. Our role in the world is to engage with our world, to collaborate with our world, to make our living together more bearable. And so I think that humility, that designers, I think we all need to kind of approach, as designers, approach our work with a fair amount of humility, where know your consequences of the work that you're doing up front, go in with a posture and mindset and humility that allows you to understand that you are not the center of the problem, and find yourself in other ways of engaging, other modes of engaging, and I think it was I'm trying to remember who it was that said this, but I think it's through the transition design seminars that I've participated in, that designers are acupuncturists, use metaphors of acupuncturists, or designers are gardeners, that just essentially just make small changes, knowing the consequences up front. I think that's really how we need to be engaging.
I am going back and looking at my notes from your statements, and thinking that really they do boil down to this question of humility and humbleness, and operating from a position of being egalitarian and being an ally. Finding ways toward collective agency. In fact, at the beginning you talked about collectivism and commons and cooperation, all these good C words, I guess. But yeah, this really kind of common core that speaks to the designer not parachuting in and stating the big thing and then leaving, but rather 2 feet on the ground and listening closely as a mode of engagement.
Yes, I think so. I think, and I see one question by one of the panelists that is somewhat related to that.
Do you want to read that question aloud?
Yeah. So it's about the work that I did with Portland Tenants United, around recombinant tools, and they wanted me to speak more about what these tools were and that I referred to. And so these were essentially a card deck that I created that was provocative by nature, but there were in three different parts. So, we're thinking about the commons and how do you essentially reclaim existing resources that have been privatized and actually get all the different stakeholders that resource touches on to understand how they might use those resources differently, collectively. So we had landlords, we had tenants, we had other folks represented in these collective conversations using these prompts. And one of the things that these prompts did was it allowed people to embody different roles. And what that does is that it forced the designer to take the back seat as well, and to embody a role that's equal to the role of others. And then to start to engage with using these prompts to talk about what are the ways in which we can think of these resources differently. And what came out of that was the group actually forcing the issue and leading to certain rules that were being changed about housing in the Portland area. So this was a collective effort. There was a collective effort that involved everybody. And so that speaks to what you were saying, Molly, is the posture of the designer walking into the space and not thinking of themselves as, well, I'm here to solve your problems for you, but I'm here to participate in your world. And I want to amplify your story. I want to illuminate the story that you want me to illuminate.
So it's the tools actually are the set of tools and the deck that lead to these kinds of approaches, these kinds of I guess approach is the word.
Yes, exactly.
Great. There's a couple questions from Jonathan Chapman. I'm going to take the first one. And Jonathan says, the pluriverse feels like it might also relate to one-to-one social interactions as much as it does culture to culture, nation to nation, or community to community. Can you speak to the challenge of developing a more pluriversal mindset as an individual where we work to embrace the differences in others?
Oof, that's really good. I wish I could turn it back on Jonathan and ask Jonathan what he thinks we could do. If I were to put myself essentially be self-reflective and instead of prescribing, because designers like to prescribe, right? And as you can tell by the way I'm answering these questions, I don't want to be prescriptive, but if I want to be self-reflective and ask myself, how do I do that one-to-one? It's really engaging with those around me. It's engaging with my neighbors. We had a conversation earlier before this, this presentation started about, the communities that we love, and what's my take on Seattle versus Portland, and that this whole idea of there's a concept of Seattle freeze. We're having a real one out here right now. But there's this idea of the Seattle freeze where people do not go beyond that first layer of engagement with those around them. I feel like it's our role as designers to be seeking to change that experience, right? Because if we're engaging, if we want to design for our world, we carry empathy with us through every single thing we do. Empathy is not a first stage in a process. Empathy is our daily life. We have to empathize with not only the humans that are around us, but we have to empathize with the products and stuff we're designing. And so being able to engage personally, I engage with my neighbors all the time. We would bake cookies and take it to neighbors we've never met and just kind of like break that ice and get to know them, because that's the way we understand our world, is through the lens of those one-to-one relationships. But so I think that would be my response, my personal response. I love, I think Molly, I think we've talked quite a bit about this, but I love that one-on-one relationship with people, and I feel like that's the way we should live in our world. But that being said, I think it's going to be a question, almost I'm going to say right back at you, Jonathan. You have to ask yourself, how do I make that work for me? How does this impact my relationship with what's other to me? You know, and I also feel like when we're thinking about issues of social injustice, I think one-to-one relationships are very important. Finding who are the people in your inner circle. You know, do you have people quite unlike you, and or is everybody like you? You know, because you can't understand people that are not like you if they're not in your circle. So you know, things like that and it's perfect for this season. You know, when Valentine's Day.
Yeah, it is. And yet it's also so challenging because this is a time where we can't actually go out and
Yeah.
mingle. We can't come close to other people. And so,
Yeah.
you know, it is Valentine's Day. We're coming up on a year of pandemic. And I think everyone everywhere in the world is probably acutely aware of the changes that we've had to make interpersonally. And yet at the same time, I'm still really optimistic, as you are, about the kinds of changes that we can make and the mindset shifts we can make.
Yes, but what it does is that it makes it really redefines what mingling means to us, right? And it, you know, obviously we can't gather in large social settings, but you can press your neighbor's doorbell and leave something at the doorstep. You know, you could text your neighbor. You could
Pass something over the gate.
You could pass something over the gate. You could have conversations and beyond the weather. You know, I find this quite unique. The Western concept of talking about the weather. You know, it's like the weather is not that interesting. There's a lot more interesting things we can talk about.
Well, one of the things you wrote about in your dissertation was the what is it? I face you, you face me housing.
Yes. Yes, well, I want to say you're one of the very few people who have read my dissertation. I'm sure about that. But you know, but one of the things that I wrote about was growing up in Nigeria. I grew up in a tenement building, and it was, you know, they were fondly known as "Face Me, I Face You," where it's like each family lived in one room, but then they had to share collective resources. Like, you know, you have to share the same kitchen, you have to share the same bathroom, you negotiate who uses the firewood and all those things. And it's really, while it's really beautiful, it's also somewhat sometimes problematic, because then you air out all your grievances in the public sphere, and which is great. It allows us, you know, I think getting to the point, you know, we're talking about the collective work I did with the tenants union. Well, you know, airing out those grievances publicly was not always beautiful. Sometimes it was a beautiful mess. You know, there was lots of conflict and disagreement and stuff like that. But it's, you know, that's really what makes us human, and that's what makes us understand each other.
So let's there's an anonymous question that I think takes this up. And this person says, the argument of understanding other worlds seems to center care and reciprocity, also from the standpoint of a desire to understand another world. What if the desire is what is in question, or perhaps residing in a tensely polarized setting? For example, with this line of thinking, I wonder how this would be amplified or applied between the oppressed and the oppressor, specifically the oppressed understanding the world of the oppressor. Is a separate space to mediate? Is this a separate space to meditate, on where other methods and techniques are applied, or perhaps a framework for this particular point of tension? There's a lot in there.
There's a lot in there, yeah. So yeah, you know, yeah, it's true. Well, for one thing, I have to say that yeah, that's a big one. You know, I think that, you know, so like I shared earlier, this allow us to, you know, the work that I'm sharing they're provocative by nature. They cause us to ask ourselves certain questions. I think when it comes to specifically to oppression, as this person mentioned, it is important for the oppressed to understand the oppressor. You know, because not so as to normalize what the oppressor does, not so as to think of the oppression as something to be absorbed or accepted as norm, but to really understand what drives them to get into this position. I think I shared some work earlier about some work that Sam Ladnash wrote in a book about becoming a Nazi versus being a Nazi. And she said, she talked, she was paraphrasing somebody else's work. And becoming a Nazi, it means that you have an opportunity to intervene and cause a paradigm shift. Someone that's a Nazi, it might be difficult to change them and change their behavior. They're committed. They've drunk the Kool-Aid, if you will. So I feel like there's an opportunity to really present a different perspective to an oppressor. Like I said earlier, it doesn't have to be gentle. It could be contentious, but it has to come from a place of understanding of what drives them. Sometimes what drives them is not positive, and you have to be able to use that against them. But just knowing what drives them, I think it's also important. So, like I said, this is one framework, and there are multiple frameworks you might potentially apply. But I think being engaged with our world means understanding our world. And I know that sometimes it's quite difficult to tell that story, especially when the world we seek to understand doesn't want to have us around. But that being said, we have to believe that understanding our world means that we can actually cause the world to respond in a different way.
Thank you for that. That was really thoughtful. I want to shift to a question that Marisol has asked, and Marisol says, "Hi Dimeji, thank you so much for your talk. What is your take on the current ways we use to design? I see you continue using the format of workshop and tools like card decks. I'd like to hear your reflections on how these traditional methods and approaches help and how they hinder the applicability of the pluriversal principles you propose." And what she says is she adds to it these formats and tools that we've been using in service design for the last 20 years or so.
Yes, and I know that one of the things that I see that's a clear limitation of what I just shared to you, but also its strength is the method that I choose to use to share the work. I'm talking in terms of principles, right? Mm-hmm. Principles are something that are very much familiar to Western-centric modes of designing. I'm talking in terms of a toolkit or a card deck or a workshop. We know IDEO workshops. We know frog design card deck and toolkits. So I do understand that. One of the things I'm doing here, though, deliberately, is using those tools to critique the discipline. Mm. So, and I want to be clear about that and very clear-eyed about that. There's some, people have asked me in the past, for example, because UX, specifically UX, user experience design, or interaction design, which I know are quite different, but very similar in many ways, are very rooted in the Western version of modernity. And I used that word version very deliberately. And so because of that, people ask, can you even have a pluriversal version of UX design? So in other words, can UX design itself be more pluriversal because it's just so rooted in Western design? And the way I think about it is that maybe this might cause us, I'm going to say this very dangerously, but maybe this might cause us to start thinking about ways in which we unravel the practice itself. So these are using your tools against you and saying, yeah, you have principles. Well, I have principles too. You do workshops, but I do workshops differently too. And but one of the things that I did in the course that I teach, I actually taught a pluriversal design course at Emily Carr. And one of the things I do with my students is have them find new methods and have them engage with their worlds differently and bring others in that use new methods. So some people have conversations with First Nations people. Some people have ways of representing their work that's not so crisp, and it's not on Miro or mural or something like that, maybe through drawings and sketches and things like that. So I think we're beginning to push the edge, and we're going to begin to push the limit. But the purpose, my purpose, is really using design's toolkit to critique design itself. And so that's why I can get away with it.
You know, I think Andrew asked a question about how you can use these tools to non-capitalist ends, Andrew Twigg, and I think you just answered that without without trying to. But I'm also struck by the fact that you're talking about, you know, as you're encouraging your own students to develop their own methods, you're, you know, just as you've gone back to things in your history, your family history, your own lived experience, as well as things you write about, care about, touch, feel in the world, you're asking your students to bring that back too. And it's almost like bringing back a notion of craft in terms of the things we use and make and materialize as designers, but into the design process anew.
Yes, I love that. And, you know, because one of the things that I always say is that design, people think that design cannot exist without use. So in other words, you know, and that's led to the fetishization of the user, right? It's always about the user. You know, we have to make this for, you know, make it useful. And so, but bringing other ways of thinking about design and engaging with the practice really causes us to think about, you know, like you were saying, bringing craft into design. Bring in, you know, I talk about these ideographs and ways in which people communicate that have existed beyond this world that we know. And it's causing us to really think about what are the ways in which we can communicate and understand our problems and present solutions to them, or actually negotiate those problems together without thinking purely in terms of use.
And, you know, it's always a question of what we apply it to. Use could be a lot broader than just a systemic approach.
Yes.
I want to pull Pat Vera's question into our conversation. We might just get to all of the questions.
And before you share that question, Pat Vera is one of my master's students at Emily Carr. And Pat is doing really fascinating work with using a pluriversal approach to her design research. I wish she had an opportunity to speak here.
Ah, very cool. Hi, Pat. Welcome to Carnegie Mellon. We're glad you're here. So Pat asks, hi, Dimeji. Thanks a lot for the presentation. You are certainly writing the lion's history. Following what Anne-Marie Willis said, our world acts back on us and designs us. So how do you see the pluriverse facilitating this ontological shift when white privilege still represents the majority who lead design among us? How does the hunter have a truthful will to set the lion free?
Get out of the way. Get out of the way. You know, make room for the lion. You know, that's one of the ways one of the ways I think about it is like, well, sometimes, you know, the most important part of acting as an ally is just making room. And I think as you're thinking about acknowledging the multiple worlds, you have to start getting out of the way. You can't build boundaries around this discipline that cause others to be excluded, however you want to define those boundaries. Those boundaries have to, and if you feel like, well, that causes design to be, we don't want design to be too blended. You know, some people think about it and it's not a discipline anymore. Well, make those boundaries permeable. Let people be able to shift in and out of them and actually provide ideas and exchange ideas from outside of it and stuff. And I think that's, to be honest, you know, I know Molly worked closely with me on this. That's the way I engaged. I engaged with my doctoral study. I was trying to test those boundaries, you know, and try to say, well, what does it mean for design to not be as we've designed it, you know, and start to think design differently.
But that's also the purpose of a doctoral study, you know, particularly in design. If you don't ask that, then what are you doing?
Yes, exactly.
I'm going to bring it back to design education. We've got one more question. Maybe we can conclude on this one. And it's from Cynthia Lawson Jaramillo. Oh gosh, we just got a second one. Okay, well, we'll see what we can do. So Cynthia says, fabulous talk, thank you. Would love to hear your thoughts on the future of design education. So thinking about your own experiences with Emily Carr, your own experiences with CMU. How can we resist the desire of students and their parents of learning how to make things to then secure jobs to pay off debt, as opposed to committing to a problem-centric education?
Yeah, you see, I can clearly be transparent and say that this is outside of my domain of expertise, but I will attempt to answer that question because I too are in academia to a certain extent, and I feel that one of the things that I've been, so I taught a course last semester, and it was a beautiful course because it was beautiful not because of the content I was teaching, even though I was teaching pluriversal design and we're trying to find new design methodologies. But it was beautiful because it was an opportunity for the students to just find themselves in a safe space and have conversations around what is important without the pressures of having to deliver a project that is that can be commercialized, right? So that they can have a strong portfolio. And one of the things I told them is that if you can think critically and if you can understand why we're here and what is causing us to work this way, you will be able to do some of that stuff on the tail end of things and actually do it more excellently. So we spend more time on the research phase. We spend more time in theory. We spend more time in discussions. We spend more time in understandings, and then the output was really amazing. But they didn't focus on the output. They were thinking more about what is this problem we're choosing to engage with. And so I feel like the answer is there somewhere. I don't know what that answer is because we find ourselves in this world that is, you know, that's very, especially in the United States, that's very capitalistic and neoliberal and a certain way. And I'm actually, I have a day job that I do these things that perpetuate some of these cultures, but I feel like as we all collectively start to understand where we're situated and try to understand what the problem is, and it would allow us to start thinking about new ways of living. And I think, I feel like that's really where transition design is trying to orient itself, is that to say, well, as this dominant paradigm, which I believe that it's not going to exist forever, as it's dying and being hospiced, there's going to be this new emergent way of being. And there are going to be some of us that have been, thinking about this and working in this space and trying to expand this, and we're going to allow it to grow into that. So but I'm sure a lot of other people have much more clever responses to that. They've been entrenched in understanding how to change pedagogy and things like that.
But I think that brings us back around to the themes that we've been talking about. And as we conclude here, since we're about at time, Helene Day Fraser had a couple of thoughts that I thought could help us to wrap up. She had said that she is interested in dissembling aspects of design linked to prescriptive universal understanding, and that as an educator, she's been wondering about getting designers to acknowledge what they bring to the work that they do, to get past the myth of the objective observer designer. And I think that what you've presented us with today was a whole number of different ways that one might do that. From your research, from your lived experience, from your practice as a painter, as a parent, as a son, as a brother, you bring as a doctoral, not that kind of doctor, but you know what I mean.
Mm-hmm.
you've brought a number of principles to bear. And so whether we're looking at the collectivism, the commons approaches, and the cooperation that undergirded your research, whether you're looking at the principles that you shared with us today that include things like staying with the trouble, acting as an ally, being multimodal, supporting collective agency, stewarding privilege, holding space, fighting symbolic violence, and getting out of the way of the lion. I think you've given us some great approaches. So Dr. Onafuwa, thank you so much for joining us. It was really a pleasure to have you here.
Thank you, Molly, and thank you, everyone. This was a lot of fun. I enjoyed it. Can't wait to hang out with you all in person soon.
Next time, next year in Pittsburgh.
Awesome.
Take good care. Thank you, everybody. Have a great day.